There is a specific kind of tension that appears when experience is quietly overridden by confidence that has never been tested under real pressure, and it doesn't arrive with shouting or confrontation. It arrives calmly, wrapped in certainty, the kind that assumes history can be replaced by systems. My name is Rowan Calderick. I was 53 years old when this happened, and for 19 years I had been the person North Shore Meridian Group relied on when transactions stopped being theoretical and started carrying consequences that could not be reversed. My official title was Executive Director of Strategic Transactions, but titles rarely describe function. I handled relationships that never lived in databases, understandings that were never written down, and deals that only worked because someone remembered why certain promises existed in the first place. Over my career at North Shore, I personally led 32 acquisitions, totaling just over $15 billion. I didn't get there through pedigree or internal politics. I started in procurement at a regional manufacturing firm in Indiana and learned early that real businesses survive downturns not because they innovate fastest, but because they remain consistent when conditions turn hostile. The transaction that was supposed to close out my time at North Shore was the acquisition of Rothwell Industrial Holdings, a 90-year-old industrial group founded in 1936 by Samuel Rothwell's grandfather. The valuation stood at $5.3 billion. The closing window was 72 hours, and the groundwork had taken nearly 2 years of deliberate alignment. That Friday afternoon, I was standing in the executive conference suite on the 42nd floor, reviewing final documents on my tablet, while Manhattan stretched below in glass and steel. The Rothwell deal wasn't just growth, it was succession planning. Samuel Rothwell was preparing to step back, his son Lucas to step forward, and the company's future depended less on price than on who would be trusted to carry the family's legacy forward. Samuel trusted me because I had been consistent for more than a decade and never promised what couldn't be delivered. That was when the door opened without a knock. Lila Ashcroft entered the room with the composure of someone whose authority had been granted before it was tested. She was 27, recently appointed Director of Strategic Transformation, a role created shortly after her Aunt Marianne assumed leadership of the governance committee. Lila moved as if the room existed to be corrected. She spoke my name as a statement rather than a greeting, while I was still reviewing a clause tied to mineral extraction rights in Montana, something insignificant on paper but essential to the Rothwell family's long-term plans. I told her we weren't scheduled, and she replied that schedules evolve, introducing herself with a title that implied inevitability. In nearly 2 decades at North Shore, I had seen versions of her role appear and disappear. Innovation leads, transformation architects, most of them gone within 2 years once internal politics shifted. She said she had concerns about how I was handling the Rothwell acquisition, and that made me look up fully. Her concern, delivered with rehearsed certainty, was that my approach relied too heavily on personal rapport and created dependency risk. North Shore, she explained, was transitioning to scalable engagement frameworks and data-driven negotiation protocols, and transactions of this size could no longer hinge on individual relationships. I listened while she spoke about optimization, system resilience, and institutional independence, language polished in classrooms rather than crisis. I told her Samuel Rothwell had requested my involvement personally and had made it clear the deal would not proceed without me. She replied that this was precisely the problem, that loyalty-based structures were unsustainable and outcomes needed to be optimized rather than personalized. I explained that family-owned industrial firms didn't respond to dashboards and that Rothwell had survived wars, recessions, and industry collapse by choosing partners carefully and maintaining continuity. She dismissed this as resistance language and cited internal charter language about prioritizing innovation over legacy dependency, reducing nearly a century of survival to a line-item risk. I told her the Rothwells cared about accountability, about knowing the person across the table would still be there when conditions changed. She responded that trust doesn't scale and slows progress, and that North Shore needed systems that didn't rely on individuals with historical leverage. At that point, the situation clarified itself. This wasn't about improving the deal, it was about removing the variable she couldn't model. When she instructed me to go home and draft a transition plan for Monday morning, I told her no. She reminded me the closing was in 72 hours and told me I should decide quickly whether I belonged at North Shore. The open office beyond the glass walls had gone silent, my assistant, Noah Price, frozen mid-motion. I told her again, no, calmly, and when she demanded compliance, I told her she didn't have the authority. She fired me on the spot, ordered security to escort me out, and labeled me a liability due to resistance to transformation. I studied her expression without anger, aware she had no understanding of what she had just severed. I asked if she was certain. She said she was, and gave me 30 minutes. I looked at the contract on my tablet and then at her, and the realization settled without emotion. She had just removed the only person who knew that the Rothwell acquisition depended on an unwritten understanding regarding Montana extraction rights, deliberately excluded from North Shore's digital systems at the family's request. What people usually misunderstand about moments like that is how quietly the damage begins. There are no alarms, no immediate collapse, no dramatic realization that something irreversible has just happened. Instead, there is a pause, a brief window where everyone assumes the system will correct itself and that whatever just occurred can still be explained away as a misunderstanding. When I walked out of North Shore Meridian's building that Friday afternoon, nothing on the street reflected what had been set in motion. Traffic moved, pedestrians passed without looking up, the glass facade behind me reflected the same confident skyline it always had. From the outside, the firm still looked stable. Inside, however, absence has weight. The moment I was no longer reachable, that weight began to press into places no process was designed to carry. By the time I reached my apartment, the first internal questions would already have started circulating. Who authorized the termination? Why legal hadn't been notified? Why HR had no documentation? Those questions don't stop a deal outright, but they slow it, and slowing a transaction that close to signing introduces uncertainty that spreads quickly. I didn't rush home, and I didn't feel panic. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, there was no closing clock running in my head, no list of contingencies waiting for resolution. I poured a drink and sat in silence, aware that the firm was beginning to realize something was missing, even if it hadn't yet identified what. I left my phone face down on the desk for several hours. When I eventually turned it over, the screen was already crowded. Missed calls from Noah Price, messages from internal numbers I recognized immediately, and one from Harold Keene, the general counsel, marked urgent. I didn't open them right away. I knew the pattern. First comes clarification, then concern, then the attempt to reverse momentum. Saturday morning arrived without urgency. I made coffee and skimmed the news, noticing how irrelevant market commentary feels when you are no longer responsible for holding a structure together. Late in the morning, curiosity won. I opened the messages. Noah had written first, asking whether HR had contacted me. A second message followed explaining that HR had no record of my termination and that legal was now involved. A third message came a little later, saying the Rothwell team had called to confirm Sunday's agenda and that Lila had taken the call herself. According to Noah, it had lasted less than 10 minutes. Samuel Rothwell's assistant had asked for me directly. Lila had said I was on temporary leave. That detail stayed with me. Temporary leave wasn't a solution, it was a delay tactic. By Saturday afternoon, the tone changed. Noah messaged again, this time about an emergency meeting involving finance and IT. They couldn't locate documentation related to the Montana subsidiary. Leela insisted it existed. IT confirmed it did not. That was the first visible fracture. The Montana entity was never meant to be documented in the way they were searching for it. It wasn't a formal carve-out or side letter, it was an understanding, negotiated quietly with Lucas Rothwell, who already held more influence than most people realized. On paper, the subsidiary looked like a liability: non-producing land, environmental exposure, maintenance costs. Any analyst trained to optimize post-acquisition performance would flag it for immediate divestment. But that land wasn't about present value, it was about future mineral rights, about preserving options for the next generation. The acquisition only worked because North Shore agreed not to interfere. That agreement lived in memory and trust, not in a server. Another message arrived from Noah later that evening. Leela had attempted to call Samuel Rothwell directly. His assistant refused to discuss the transaction with anyone but me. Leela responded by saying I was unavailable due to personal issues, but had fully briefed her. Noah asked what she was doing. I didn't answer. Improvisation at that level isn't flexibility, it's risk. Late Saturday night, Harold Keene's message came through again, careful and measured. He said there appeared to have been a breakdown in authority regarding my termination and asked me to call immediately to discuss options before Monday's closing. The language was deliberate. Breakdown in authority meant someone had acted without coverage. Options meant reversal was already being considered. I didn't respond. Silence in that moment wasn't avoidance, it was leverage. By Sunday morning, the messages slowed, then stopped altogether. That told me everything I needed to know. They had moved from prevention to assessment. They were counting what had been lost and realizing how little of it could be reconstructed. Late Sunday evening, my phone vibrated with a number I didn't have saved but recognized immediately: Samuel Rothwell's private line. He didn't leave a voicemail. He didn't need to. When someone like Samuel calls without explanation, it isn't a request, it's an opening. I looked at the phone for a long moment before setting it back down, knowing that whatever happened next would not happen on North Shore Meridian's terms. Silence has a way of changing meaning once it stretches long enough. At first, it feels like control, then it becomes pressure, and eventually it turns into an accusation. By Sunday night, North Shore Meridian was no longer asking whether something had gone wrong, it was trying to understand how much authority it had already lost. I still hadn't returned a single call. That wasn't strategy so much as restraint. I had spent most of my career reacting quickly, smoothing edges, closing gaps before they widened. This time, speed would only have helped them pretend the structure was still intact. I let the silence do its work. I slept well that night, the kind of sleep you get when you are no longer responsible for protecting other people from their own decisions. Monday morning arrived without urgency. I made breakfast, read a few pages of a book I had been meaning to finish for months, and waited. The call came just after 8, Harold Keene's number again. This time I answered. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Rowan, thank you for picking up. We need to clarify what happened on Friday." "Clarify is an interesting word," I said. "It implies ambiguity." There was a pause on the other end, then a careful shift in tone. "There appears to have been a procedural breakdown. Your termination was not reviewed by legal or approved by the board. That doesn't make it a misunderstanding, Harold. It makes it unauthorized." Another pause. He acknowledged that and moved quickly to the real point. "The Rothwell closing is now at risk. Certain information cannot be located internally. We need your assistance to stabilize the situation." Assistance, not reinstatement, not an apology. I told him I was no longer an employee and that North Shore would need to work with whatever documentation existed in their official systems. He asked if I would be willing to consult, even temporarily, to ensure continuity. I told him I would think about it. We both knew that was polite deferral, not consideration. Within an hour, Noah called. His voice was tight, controlled, the way people sound when they're trying not to say too much on a recorded line. Leela had been called into a board meeting. Marianne Ashcroft was present. Finance had flagged the Montana subsidiary as a material risk. The Rothwell legal team had refused to proceed without confirmation from me. Noah asked what he should do. I told him nothing. He was silent for a moment, then said he understood. By late morning, the pressure escalated. A message came through from Marianne Ashcroft herself, brief and direct. "Rowan, please call me at your earliest convenience. We need to resolve this quickly." That message carried weight. Marianne didn't reach out unless the situation had moved beyond containment. I waited an hour before responding. When we spoke, she didn't pretend this was about culture or transformation. She asked whether I would be willing to return long enough to close the Rothwell acquisition. Return under what authority, I asked. She said that could be discussed. I asked whether Lila's decision to terminate me would be formally reversed. Another pause. She said the board was still reviewing the circumstances. That was my answer. I told her I would not participate in a transaction where authority was unclear and accountability was optional. She said she understood and asked what it would take to change my mind. I told her I wasn't negotiating with North Shore anymore. The call ended politely. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't confusion now, it was recognition. They understood that the leverage they assumed lived in titles and systems had already shifted. Around noon, another call came in, this one from a number I hadn't seen in years. Lucas Rothwell. He didn't bother with small talk. "My father is confused," he said. "He's being told you're unavailable, but nothing makes sense without you." I told him exactly what had happened, without embellishment or emotion. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. They asked whether the Montana land could be sold post-acquisition. I told them that would end the deal. They didn't seem to understand why. That told me everything I needed to know. The Rothwells hadn't lost trust in me, they had lost confidence in North Shore. Lucas asked where I stood. I told him the truth. I was no longer involved unless circumstances changed. He said his father would call me later. That call came in the afternoon. Samuel Rothwell didn't sound angry, he sounded disappointed, which is far worse. "They seem very focused on efficiency," he said. "They seem less interested in understanding what they're buying." I told him that was no longer my problem. He asked whether I would be willing to meet him in person the following morning. Off-site, no lawyers, no advisors, just breakfast. I agreed. After the call ended, I sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. The balance had shifted completely. North Shore Meridian was still operating as if this were an internal issue, a personnel problem that could be corrected with authority and urgency. It wasn't. It had become a question of trust, and trust doesn't respond to escalation, it responds to alignment. And alignment, once broken, rarely returns to its original shape. The breakfast meeting took place far from boardrooms and conference calls, in a quiet dining room that favored discretion over presentation, the kind of place where conversations stayed at the table and decisions were made without witnesses. Samuel Rothwell arrived early, as he always did, dressed simply, without the armor executives tend to wear when they believe they're being evaluated. He stood when he saw me, shook my hand, and didn't say anything for a moment, as if confirming for himself that I was still exactly where he expected me to be. We ordered coffee before we spoke. That silence mattered. It was the same silence that had anchored every serious discussion we'd ever had, a pause that allowed intent to surface before words complicated it. Samuel didn't ask why North Shore had acted the way it did. He didn't need the explanation. He asked a better question. "Do you still believe this deal works," he said, "if handled correctly?" I told him the truth. The structure worked, the valuation was fair, the operational synergies were real, but the conditions that made the deal possible no longer existed. He nodded slowly, absorbing that without surprise. Lucas joined us a few minutes later, more reserved than his father, already carrying the weight of decisions that would follow him for decades. He asked whether North Shore understood what they were risking. I said they understood numbers, not consequences. That distinction landed. Samuel leaned back slightly and asked what I would do if I were in their position. I told him I wouldn't be in their position because I wouldn't have removed continuity from a succession-driven acquisition. He smiled faintly at that. Then he asked the question North Shore hadn't. What would it take for you to stay involved? I told him I wouldn't return to North Shore under any circumstances. Titles and reversals wouldn't fix what had been exposed. Authority without understanding was not something I intended to support. Lucas asked whether I would consider continuing on their side instead, not as an advisor, not as a consultant, but as a partner responsible for managing the transition, protecting the family's interests, and finding a buyer who understood what they were acquiring. The question was direct and carried no theatrics. Samuel slid a slim folder across the table. Inside was a proposal, already drafted, already approved within the family. Senior operating partner, equity participation tied to long-term performance, full authority over the transaction strategy. My role would be to design the exit, not execute someone else's process. I didn't respond immediately. I read the document carefully, not because I needed time to decide, but because decisions like that deserve respect. I told them I would accept under one condition. They asked what it was. That the meeting scheduled with North Shore for later that day would still happen. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Samuel smiled. He understood immediately. He wanted them to see where the leverage had actually moved. The meeting took place in a neutral space, not North Shore's offices, which was already a signal. Their delegation arrived tense, over-prepared, and visibly uncertain. Leela Ashcroft was there, along with Mary Ann, legal counsel, and two partners who looked as though they hadn't slept. When Samuel entered with me at his side, the room shifted. Lila's confidence faltered for the first time. Mary Ann recovered quickly, extending a hand and offering apologies framed as misunderstandings. Samuel listened without interruption, then corrected her gently. "This is not a misunderstanding," he said. "This is alignment failure." He introduced me not as a former employee, but as his senior partner. That distinction landed harder than any accusation could have. Lila attempted to speak, referencing frameworks, process integrity, transition models. Samuel stopped her with a raised hand. He asked a single question: who authorized the sale of the Montana land? She hesitated. No one had, she said, but the option had been discussed internally. Samuel nodded once. "That discussion ends the deal," he replied. The room went quiet. He turned to Mary Ann and explained that the trust he had placed in North Shore was contingent on continuity and respect for non-documented agreements, and that trust no longer existed. He thanked them for their time and stood. As we left, Lila finally spoke, asking how this could have happened so quickly. I told her it hadn't. It had taken years. The mistake was thinking it could be undone in hours. Outside, Samuel asked how it felt to be on the other side of the table. I told him it felt like balance. By the end of the week, North Shore Meridian's deal pipeline was under review, not because of numbers, but because reputation had entered the equation. And reputation, once damaged, is not something any system can optimize away. Public consequences rarely arrive with the force people expect. There was no announcement, no press release explaining why the Rothwell acquisition had collapsed, just a subtle shift in tone that spread quietly through financial circles, and then hardened into fact. By the end of that week, North Shore Meridian was no longer answering questions about when the deal would close. Instead, they were fielding inquiries about governance, authority, and internal controls. Those are the kinds of questions that don't come from curiosity, they come from caution. Internally, the firm moved fast, but speed couldn't replace coherence. Emergency meetings were called. Outside counsel was retained. Leela Ashcroft was removed from direct oversight of transactions, not as punishment, but as containment. Mary Ann Ashcroft stepped into a visible leadership role to reassure partners and investors that order still existed. It did, technically. What no longer existed was credibility. I watched all of it from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet clarity that comes when cause and effect finally align. Samuel and Lucas Rothwell proceeded exactly as we had discussed. They informed North Shore formally that negotiations were terminated due to material misalignment and misrepresentation. No accusations were made, none were necessary. The absence of explanation carried more weight than any argument. Almost immediately, inquiries began arriving from other firms, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. The Rothwells had something valuable, not just assets, but stability, and stability attracts serious buyers. My role shifted quickly from reaction to construction. We weren't rushing, there was no reason to. The market had already done the work of filtering. Meanwhile, North Shore Meridian was experiencing a different kind of acceleration. Deals that had been considered soft commitments suddenly stalled. Clients asked to revisit terms. Others requested confirmation of lead contacts, specifically asking whether continuity would be guaranteed. Those questions weren't hostile, but they were diagnostic. Firms like North Shore survive on assumption, the assumption that the people across the table will still be there when the paperwork clears. Once that assumption weakens, everything becomes provisional. I received one final call from Harold Keene late the following week. His tone was no longer urgent, it was resigned. He told me the board had concluded its review. Leela's authority had been formally curtailed. New approval protocols were being implemented. He asked, without expectation, whether I would reconsider a short-term advisory role to help stabilize relationships. I told him no. Not because I wanted them to fail, but because failure was no longer the issue. Trust had been reallocated, and trust doesn't respond to remediation plans. He thanked me for my time. That was the last conversation I had with anyone at North Shore Meridian. 2 weeks later, the Rothwells accepted a revised offer from a different group, one that understood exactly what it was acquiring and why certain elements were not negotiable. The valuation was slightly lower than North Shore's, but the structure was cleaner, and the governance terms were explicit. Samuel didn't hesitate. He told me later that price was secondary to certainty. Lucas was already planning integration with a level of care that confirmed we had made the right decision. As for Leela, her professional trajectory changed quietly. There was no dismissal, no scandal. She was reassigned, then eventually moved out of the firm altogether. Her resume would still look impressive. It always does when context is removed. But reputation is cumulative, and within the circles that mattered, the story had already settled. North Shore Meridian continued operating, but 6 months later it was acquired at a valuation that reflected diminished confidence, not financial weakness. The market had adjusted for risk that could not be modeled. I didn't celebrate that outcome. I observed it. The lesson wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about sequence. Experience exists to prevent avoidable loss, not to obstruct progress. When it is dismissed as friction instead of context, systems don't become stronger, they become blind, and blindness at scale is expensive. Time has a way of simplifying things once the noise fades. A year after the Rothwell transaction collapsed, the story was no longer about a single deal or a single decision. It had become an example people referenced quietly when discussing governance, authority, and the difference between formal control and actual influence. North Shore Meridian still existed, still issued reports, still hosted investor calls, but the firm operated with a different posture. It moved more cautiously, relied more heavily on committees, and spoke often about alignment and oversight. Those are not signs of collapse, they are signs of correction. What never returned was the assumption that experience could be substituted without cost. That assumption had been priced in, and the market had adjusted accordingly. For the Rothwells, the transition unfolded exactly as intended. The new ownership respected the boundaries that had been established, preserved the Montana land without debate, and integrated operations gradually rather than aggressively. Lucas stepped fully into leadership within the first year, and Samuel remained involved just long enough to ensure continuity before stepping away entirely. Stability did what stability always does. It compounded quietly. My role settled into something less visible and far more effective. I wasn't managing crises or defending decisions anymore. I was shaping outcomes before pressure distorted them. That was the work I had always done best, just without the illusion that systems could replace judgment. Occasionally, someone would ask whether I missed North Shore Meridian, whether I felt any satisfaction watching the firm struggle to recover its footing. The honest answer was no. What happened there wasn't a victory or a loss, it was a transfer of responsibility. Authority had been exercised without understanding, and responsibility had moved to where understanding still existed. That is how organizations correct themselves, not through outrage, but through redistribution. I heard later that Lila Ashcroft had taken a role at a different firm, one focused on internal strategy rather than external transactions. There was no malice in that outcome. She had learned, at a high price, that confidence without context is not leadership, and that influence borrowed from structure disappears the moment structure is questioned. If she was smart, she would carry that lesson forward. If she wasn't, the market would teach it again. The board at North Shore eventually formalized new protocols around deal continuity and relationship ownership, rules designed to prevent any single individual from holding non-documented leverage. On paper, it looked sensible. In practice, it missed the point entirely. The problem was never that one person knew too much. The problem was assuming that knowledge could be removed without consequence. You can document procedures, you can standardize reporting. What you cannot do is automate trust or archive judgment. Those things live in people, not systems. Looking back, the most revealing moment wasn't the firing or the collapse of the deal. It was the assumption that everything important had already been captured digitally, that nothing essential could exist outside approved channels. That belief is comforting, especially to people early in their careers, because it suggests control is complete. It never is. The real work always happens in the margins, in conversations that aren't recorded and decisions that don't announce themselves. I still work the same way I always have. I listen more than I speak, I don't promise what can't be delivered, and I never confuse authority with understanding. When younger executives ask for advice, I tell them something simple. Systems are tools, not substitutes. Experience isn't resistance. And if you ever decide to remove the person holding a deal together, make sure you know exactly what they're holding before you let go. That lesson cost one company billions. Others would do well to learn it more cheaply.